And one bit of evidence for this is that we can predict, and this is true experimentally, we can predict in careful experiments what you're going to choose to do even 7 seconds ahead of when you're consciously aware of having chosen. We can predict from your brain activity what you're going to do. So your brain activity actually predates your conscious awareness of your choice, in some cases by 7 seconds. There's lots of evidence like this. So if you're gonna have a theory of free will, you have to understand how it comports with this fact. Sam Harris, in his book Free Will, says, how can we be free as conscious agents if everything that we consciously intend is caused by events in our brain that we do not intend and of which we are entirely unaware? We can't. And that is, again, the received opinion of my colleagues in the neurosciences and in philosophy. So, we seem to have free will, but we're really being pulled around, and the puppet master is our brain and the neurons, and behind that, the genes that made our brain. So we're literally puppets being pulled around by genes working through our brains. That's the view. That's determinists. It's not clear, by the way, even in a Newtonian world, whether determinism is true. There's something called Norton's dome that I won't go into, but it's just very interesting that even in Newtonian world, determinism may not be true, but that's still not a problem for these determinists. Because they'll say there's also chance, right? Whenever you see probabilities in a scientific theory, you're going to have to interpret those probabilities, and one way that's commonly interpreted is objective chance. So Sam Harris says, either our wills are determined by prior causes, and we're not responsible for them, or they are the product of chance, and we're not responsible for them. And those are the only two options. Either they're determined by causes or they're determined by chance. In either case, you can't take responsibility for it. So that's the received opinion of I would say, 98% of my colleagues. There are compatibilists who say, yeah, our behavior is determined, just as we talked about, but still you have a notion of free will. After all, it is your neurons and your genes that are making you do what you do. So you have free will. Most of us, that's not quite good enough, right? I'm also growing fingernails, and in some sense, I don't want to think that I'm exercising free will to grow my fingernails. So somehow, that doesn't quite do it. Then there are also libertarians, and this is the third major view, that free will somehow rises above the plane of cause and effect of the physical world. And basically, no self-respecting neuroscientist or philosopher takes this point of view. So it's just not, it's not among academics a credible view, partly because it's dualist. So the theories of free will are determinists, compatibilists, and libertarians, as we just talked about. All of them are physicalists, and what they think is that our brains cause our conscious experiences and our behavior. But they have no idea how, and in other talks I've discussed this issue, the hard problem of consciousness. There's no theory that a scientist has ever come up with that explains how neural activity could cause a single conscious experience, like the taste of chocolate. No one's been able to do it. Every time a theory tries to start with neural activity and give you the taste of chocolate, at the moment the chocolate appears, it's really like a rabbit popping out of the hat. No explanation. So, my team is looking at a different approach. Let's start with consciousness as being fundamental. And we'll try to see if we can start with a mathematical model and get back what we call the physical world as a limiting representation. And one aspect of this comes from the theory of evolution. It turns out that if our senses evolved and were shaped by natural selection, one can prove, because evolution, behind evolution as some mathematics, you can actually prove that the probability is zero that our senses would evolve to show us the truth. And that means that our perceptions of space and time and physical objects are almost surely probability zero, not the truth. This just follows from evolutionary theory. I've published this. It's very, very clear. No one's been able to contradict it. It's coming out. I've got a book coming out in the summer, The Case Against Reality, How Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes, where I go through this in great detail. So the idea is this is all a virtual reality. The space you perceive around you right now is a 3D virtual world, and all the objects, tables, and chairs are your creation. In a virtual world, I see you, look, you disappear, then I create you again. And that's what's happening right here. We create space, we create time, we create objects on the fly. So the idea is that we start with consciousness, and then we have to understand how we create the physical world and also the brain and neurons. So I tell my colleagues that neurons do not exist when they're not perceived. And neurons have no causal powers, and in particular, they cause none of our conscious experiences and none of our behavior. And they can't laugh me off the stage because I've got a theorem. So how do we start with consciousness being fundamental? Well, as a scientist, I want to be precise so I can find out precisely why my theory is wrong. So let's assume there's some world, and that what I'll call a conscious agent has a field of possible experiences. This is an awareness space, and the points of the space are the particular contents that your awareness could have. And usually the awareness space is limited. Try to think of a specific color experience that you've never seen before. A specific color you've never seen before. Does anything happen? You're seeing the limits of your awareness space. Pigeons have 4 color receptors. They're seeing colors you can't even imagine. Their color awareness space is bigger than yours. And then we have a class of actions that we can take, and those affect the world. So we have this triad, the world affecting our field of awareness, and then so that's the world, W, X is the field of awareness, and G is the set of your actions. And the world affects you by perception, I'm calling that P. So the world affects your perceptions, so that's a map. And it's a probabilistic map. For any state of the world, there's certain probabilities that you will have certain experiences. And then once you have an experience, like if I see a chocolate croissant, then I can make a decision. There's a high probability that I will act to eat the chocolate croissant, and a low probability that I will act to eat the celery stick. So that's what D is. For each thing I'm seeing, what are the probabilities for the actions I might take? And already you can see there's hints of free will here, right? This is going to be, these probabilities in this model are where I'm going to get my model of free will. And then my actions then affect the state of the world also probabilistically. So that's the conscious agent. It's that little triad. It's actually got 7 components. And for mathematicians, W, X, and G are probability spaces, P, D, A are Markov kernels, and N's an integer. For the rest of us, it's just what I said. But the point is, it's precise so that mathematicians can argue on details on this. So I can have 2 conscious agents interacting. The actions of one conscious agent can affect my experiences. My experiences will affect how I decide. My actions will affect the experience of the other guy. And what we have, the idea then, is that the universe is a vast social network of conscious agents interacting. That's what the fundamental nature of reality is. Again, I'm probably wrong, but at least I'm precise, and we can play with this and see where it leads us. Can we actually understand our spiritual experiences? Can we get back modern physics? Can we get it all from this model or not? So it's precise, so we can find out precisely if we're wrong. And that's the goal. Of course we're probably wrong, but the point is to be absolutely precise so we can figure out where we're wrong and then move on. So this leads to a notion of distributed free will. There are very simple agents. Their field of awareness is very, very trivial. They only have what I call 1 bit. There are 2 experiences that they could possibly have in their field of awareness. So I call those 1-bit agents. But it turns out the mathematics allows those 1-bit agents to interact, and they, in their interaction, can create a 2-bit agent. And the 2-bit agents can create 4-bit agents, and all the way up to infinity. And so you get this lattice. It's a vast social network. And at the bottom are the 1-bit agents. At the top are infinite consciousnesses, which now we're getting into spirituality. So this model allows you to go from us to infinite spiritual situations. And each level, the agents have their own free will, decisions that they can make, but when they combine to make new agents at a higher level, those new agents have a new non-reductionistic ability to have free will. And the free will decisions below influence the decisions above, and the decisions above influence decisions below. So what we get is this, for scientists, this is fun because this is just a fun system, complicated system to simulate, but it's a very, very complex, multi-dimensional and dynamical model of free will. And we're working right now to simulate it. Here's an objection that my colleagues will have to this, although Einstein wasn't one of my colleagues. I feel that I will to light my pipe, said Einstein, and I do it. But how can I connect this up with the idea of freedom? What is behind the act of willing to light the pipe? Another act of willing? In other words, the idea is that free will leads to darkness. What is my freedom to be free? How can I choose what I choose? And Sam Harris says the same. I do not choose to choose what I choose. There is a regress here that always ends in darkness. So they're saying there's an explanatory gap here. If you're talking about free will is just sort of magic. So free will, you get this regress, it ends in darkness, and it's just magic. Well, as we said before, according to Sam Harris, either our wills are determined by prior causes and we're not responsible for them, or they're product of chance and we're not responsible for them. Well, it turns out the very notion of cause itself ends in magic. When philosophers and physicists try to think about what they mean by causation, here's what they end up saying. There is still very little agreement on the most central question concerning causation. What is it? Laws, counterfactual dependence, manipulability, transfer of energy. We don't have a received opinion of causality. It's a tough, open question. One of the greatest scientists right now working on causal models, and he's a genius, a pioneer, Judea Pearl. In his recent book, The Book of Why, says, in his book, any attempt to define causation in terms of seemingly simpler first-run concepts must fail. That's why I've not attempted to define causation anywhere in this book. That's where we are. So cause, you can't talk about the cause of a cause. What's the cause of the cause? You end in darkness, just like you can't talk about what do I choose, how do I choose to choose. So we're not any worse off than the causal people. Chance, well, David Hume said chance is a mere negative word and means not any real power which has anywhere a being in nature. We've made a little progress since Hume. There's a recent book, The Philosophical Guide to Chance by Toby Hatfield, great book. And he says at the end of his review of it, I recommend that we take an anti-realist attitude towards chance. In other words, it's not real. And he says, I reached this conclusion reluctantly, but no better opinion is available. So the two pillars of modern anti-free will thought are chance and causality, and both of them end in a regress that ends in darkness. So they're in no better place than those of us who postulate free will. The real issue is this. Do you want to start with a physical world that's unconscious, purely unconscious ingredients? Then you're stuck with causality and chance. If you start with the realm of conscious agents, where agency is fundamental, then whenever you see probabilities, it's not objective chance, it's free will. And we're equal in terms of, that's where explanation stops. But no problem. In every scientific theory, we have miracles. We don't call them that. We call them our presuppositions or our assumptions. But there are miracles. And every theory assumes the miracles and then it explains other stuff. So assuming causality and chance is just as much a miracle as assuming free will. And the Supreme Court has told us to deny free will is inconsistent with the underlying precepts of our criminal justice system. Who am I to contradict the Supreme Court? But even more to the point to the scientists, a very famous scientist, Hans Primus, said, the framework of experimental science requires the freedom of action as a constitutive, though tacit, presupposition. The experimenter has to be free to choose how he's manipulating nature. If you don't have that assumption, the whole scientific method falls apart. So just to do science, you require freedom of the experimenter. So conscious realism makes it possible to have a limited amount of free will, but it's a very interesting, huge dynamical system. We're participating in a vast social network where free will is the coin of the realm. Thank you very much.